We're going to have a conversation a little bit about how we collect, use, secure, and share data. So it fits right into the data frame. And we've really got two experts with us today, and I'm going to let Dr. Cavoukian, who's literally written the book on privacy by design, start out with 5 minutes, and then David Vladeck will do 5 minutes, and then we'll have some questions, mine as well as from the audience, obviously. Go ahead.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is such a pleasure to be here. It's such an experience. I'm going to start with something unusual, though. I'm going to start with an ask. I'm going to ask you to change the way that you think. And that may seem like asking for a lot, but the future of privacy and the future of freedom may rest upon this. Let me be clear. People confuse what privacy is about. They think that privacy and big data don't go hand in hand. They think privacy versus security, privacy versus business interests. That is a fundamentally zero-sum way of looking at the problem and is inherently flawed. Yesterday you heard a lot about zero-sum, and I'm going to ask you to abandon that dated way of thinking. It's very yesterday, and it will get in the way of your innovations. What I'm going to ask you to do is work with me to change the paradigm, because not only the future of privacy rests on that, the future of freedom rests on that. Privacy does not equal secrecy. Privacy equals control. It equals freedom of choice. It equals freedom. It's not just an individual right. If you look at societies that have morphed from a free and democratic state into a totalitarian state, the first thread to unravel is privacy. Historians, academics who have studied this have made these conclusions. So when I ask you to work with me to preserve the future of privacy, it's not a light request. It's the future of our freedom. And look at how much people are willing to give up to ensure freedoms. Look at what's happening in the Middle East. So when I ask you to change the paradigm, it's as simple as changing it from zero-sum to positive-sum. Positive-sum is a much less known term. And you'll have to forgive me. When I was in graduate school many years ago, game theory was a really big deal. And I studied game theory, and I loved it. But the focus was always on zero-sum. Zero-sum essentially says you can have more of one interest at the expense of another interest, such that the two total the sum of zero. This is fundamentally flawed when you apply it to privacy versus other interests, because I can tell you, whenever other interests increase, security, business interests, anything, it's always at the expense of privacy. And that, in my world, is unacceptable. And it's unnecessary, because you can have both. Think of positive sum as being a positive solution that will enable you to have multiple interests. All you have to do is get rid of the versus and substitute and. You can create a win-win strategy that abandons false dichotomies, that abandons trade-offs and that are essentially unnecessary. And I want to make it clear, this is real. We have been doing this for quite a while, and I'll show you exactly what I mean when I talk about privacy by design. Privacy by design is built upon this positive sum form of thinking. And essentially, what privacy by design says is be proactive. Embed privacy in the solutions you're developing, in the design options you're considering, in business practices. Embed it proactively. Build it in as an essential component. That way, you're not going to be caught unaware after the fact. Minimize your collections of data. Data minimization is a big deal in the privacy world. And what it relates to is personally identifiable data. So to be clear, privacy relates to information that is linked to personal identifiers, name, social security number, things of that nature. If you don't have personal identifiers linked to the data, do whatever you want with the data. Yesterday, we heard about all these fabulous expanded visions of the world and projections using big data and data analytics. This is great. When there's no PII, personally identifiable data, you don't have to consider these privacy options. But once the data is linked or capable of being linked to personally identifiable information, it changes the game, because then you have information about an individual that you're collecting, you're using, perhaps you're disclosing to unauthorized third parties that the individual hasn't consented to. So remember, privacy is about control. The individual should control what happens to their information. The Germans have a wonderful term called informational self-determination. big term, simple concept. It should be the individual who determines the fate of his or her information. And remember, in the context of big data, that will be a real plus to you because accuracy is absolutely critical to information, to data, to make it valuable as information. And essential to control is context. There's no one who knows the context of the information better than the actual user to whom the data apply. The good news, last year in Jerusalem, once a year there's an International Privacy Commissioners Conference. Data protection authorities get together once a year, usually in Europe. Last year we met in Jerusalem. We passed an international resolution which made privacy by design the international standard globally. So everyone is behind this in terms of making it proactive. And by making it proactive, what you do is you avoid the privacy harm from arising. In the process, you save yourself an enormous amount of hassle and cost, and you can avoid the burden of regulatory compliance if you prevent the privacy harm from arising. These are the 7 principles. I'm not going to dwell on them because I don't want to take up any more time than there is. If you go to our website, privacybydesign.ca, you can find all of this there and more. And you can follow us on Twitter. We're at Embed Privacy, one word. What I want to make clear is this will cost you less. It will cost you less than anything else than the regulatory burden that will arise afterwards if you collect information improperly, if you use information improperly, if you have a data breach. It will also preserve your brand. You don't want to have a privacy investigation arise. It will damage your reputation. It costs significant, not just dollars and cents, but it will damage your business. So proactively embedding it in advance costs very little. Afterwards, not only do you lose consumer confidence and trust, you have to deal with often class action lawsuits, damage to your reputation, damage to your brand. So just to be clear, these are a few of our publications because I want you to know this is real now. It is working. We've applied it to biometrics. We've applied it to RFID solutions. We've applied it to the smart grid and smart meters that are out there. What is a fallacy is that privacy is in the steps in the way of innovation. Nonsense. Privacy is an enabler of innovation, and I need you. This is a call to action. I need bright, brilliant minds like you to incorporate this in all that you do. So I'm going to wrap it up, and this is it. You can avoid the regulatory harm by going at the front end and building it in. And what you can do is privacy by design or privacy by disaster. You know the answer to that. The choice is yours. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. You can tell how passionate Dr. Cavoukian is for the subject. I'm going to now turn to David Vladeck, the Chief Enforcer of Privacy in the United States with the FTC.
So good afternoon or good morning still. I'm the kind of guy who's like the gym teacher at the high school prom. I'm the guy you don't want to see, and frankly, I don't want to see you either. So let me talk to you a little about what the FTC is, what we're looking at, and how we can avoid meeting again, which I think should be your goal. So the Federal Trade Commission, as my buddy Danny Weitzner said, we are the privacy enforcers in the United States. We have a role in setting privacy policy. We triggered a rethink administration-wide in terms of privacy framework early in 2009 when we announced that we were going to hold roundtables around the country because we were concerned that the privacy framework we had been using all along didn't map on well, not just to the internet, but to emerging technologies like then smartphones and tablets. Our jurisdiction really focuses on 2 areas. One is protecting consumer privacy, and the second is data security, which go hand in hand, as Anne points out. Privacy by design, and we all thank Anne for her leadership on this, really is a double-edged benefit. It helps you get out of concerns about data breaches. And second, it helps you build privacy protections into your business model, which is one way to keep me away from your door. I know a lot of you are engaged in new technologies and new innovation. We applaud your work as a society. We reap tremendous benefit from the innovations that you've been able to deliver to the marketplace. but there's a but coming, and here's the but. You need to be sensitive to privacy and data concerns. One issue that we've seen repeatedly overlooked in this space is protecting children's privacy. One of the statutes we enforce is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. We now have a fully operational forensic mobile lab where we, among other things, test apps, lots of apps. We develop our own apps to see, just to see the capacity that we can build into apps on our own. But we've seen increasingly developers of apps aimed at children, 12 and under, pulling down all sorts of data, including geolocation data, email addresses, and things like that, that the law forbids them from doing. Under the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, you can't pull down data that may be identifiable to an individual kid without explicit parental permission. We've just announced publicly our first settlement against a mobile app developer that was pulling down geolocation data and other data, W3 Innovations. But in our labs, we're seeing increasingly mobile apps that indiscriminately pull down geolocation data, contact information, all sorts of other things that are wholly unrelated to functionality. So one urge of caution is, if you don't want to see us, and this fits into privacy by design, don't collect data you don't need. Don't collect data that's unrelated to the functionality of your app. Online behavioral advertising. We've been very active in promoting ways of giving consumers better control over their own browsing habits on the internet. We released a report, a staff report last year that floated the idea of do not track. I think we'll probably, if we have time, talk a little more in depth about do not track later on. But the good news is that both the browser manufacturers and the advertisers, I think, now see the benefits of providing enhanced consumer control. The browser manufacturers have moved ahead, as have the advertising industry. We're heartened to see those advances. Let me talk to you a little about data security. This is an area where we think we're not making much progress. We investigate data breaches all the time, and one of the things that we find is that even big companies holding on to data that we all would agree should be held in the most secure way imaginable, things like social security numbers, are not being protected with the vigilance that is required. If you're going to hold on to people's personal information, the social contract that ought to underline that is that you ought to take all reasonable measures to keep that information secure, free from being hacked into or otherwise shared with third parties on an unintended way. But time and time again, our investigations see very lax security measures that really don't meet any reasonable standard. So another tip, basically, to keep me at bay is think a lot about data security. A lot of the security that's available today is free or it's off the shelf. It's not all that expensive. What it does take is vigilance. You have to put on the patches when they need to be. This is an issue that you can't just relegate to the back burner. It should be foremost in your mind at all times. Let me talk about two last things. One is public education. For those of you who are startups, you don't have legal staff on hand, go look at our website, www.ftc.gov. There's a menu on the right hand. It's not a very spiffy website, I'm sorry. For you web designers, it's going to look clunky and archaic. But if you click on privacy, there's a huge amount of information about both the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act and privacy generally, and in addition on online behavioral advertising. If you want to steer clear of the Federal Trade Commission, the easiest way to do it is simply to look at our public education materials. If there are questions, there are lawyers at the agency who will be glad to answer them. I'm not going to tell you the Ronald Reagan line, we're the government, we're here to help. but we actually do help a lot of startups figure out how to tailor their business model in a way that allows innovation, but also keeps them on the right side of the law. Believe me, we have plenty to do. We don't want to see you. You don't want to see us. Let's work together and keep it that way. Thank you.
Great. So as people are making their way to the microphones for questions, I'll just ask one of my own. For Dr. Cavoukian, what's the best privacy innovation that you've seen this year? And maybe, David, you'd follow up as well.
There are several I can point to. One is the use of something called biometric encryption. You combine it with facial recognition technology, with biometrics, and the beauty of it, it serves the same purpose as the facial recognition technology, but there is no collection or retention of a biometric template, which is the actual representation of your biometric in the database. That way, if for whatever reasons the police come with a court order, or even if there's a brute force attack that opens up that cell, what do they get? They don't get your biometric. There's no representation of your biometric. All they get is what your biometric encrypted, some other data, a meaningless alphanumeric or PIN number. So that's a brilliant technology. There's another one called Bearing Media. This is a company that, there's been a big issue with behavioral targeted advertising. Not a good thing to be doing. What they do is they have a double-blind privacy architecture that allows companies to send their ads to particular demographics and particular neighborhoods, but they never know the information relating to the geolocation data, and the geolocation data holder doesn't know the other information. It's a double-blind privacy architecture. It's brilliant. So there are two offhand. Both of them follow privacy by design to the core.
David, any innovation this year that's really struck you as outstanding?
I'd like to follow up on Ann's point. I think there's been a lot of innovation in online behavioral advertising to try to give consumers greater control. I think we all recognize that online behavioral advertising is an important business model. It served us well, but it's time to think about easing the burden on consumers to having greater control. I think a lot of the innovations this year push in that direction. Yes, there's more that needs to be done, but I'm heartened at the progress. I would talk a little about facial recognition and biometrics. This is an emerging area that, as Ann points out, can provide privacy protection, but also can lead to privacy invasions of a scale that are really worrisome. The Federal Trade Commission is holding a workshop, and it'll be available on the web on December 8th to really take a hard look at facial recognition profiling, biometric sensors, and sort of we're trying to look around the corner. As you know, facial recognition programs have existed for 30 years. But we're starting to see them commercialized. We need to think through the privacy implications of this. We need your help to do that.
Great. Question.
Hi. Thank you, panelists. My name's Catherine Posey, founder of Tech by Superwomen. Dr. Ann, I've had the privilege of seeing your presentation at the Privacy, Identity, and Innovation Conference back in Seattle in 2010. I agree that privacy is about control. It's not about secrecy, and Dana Boyd has some great points on that as well. My question is twofold. It's kind of looking at both as consumer and then from the company side. We talk about don't collect data that you don't need. I think one of the challenges on the company side is this space is changing so fast. They're not always clear what data they're going to need. So there's kind of this idea of just collect as much as possible, because as you're innovating and changing your services, you may need different sets, to optimize it. And on the consumer side, things that we don't care about now or aren't aware that can embarrass us, if you will. Later we find out, maybe I don't want you to have that information, like our information's being tracked on our phones and our movements. So my question is, given that the space is changing so rapidly, what advice do you have for people on how to harness that challenge?
What I would say that to businesses is, first of all, privacy can give you a real payoff. The last book I wrote was called The Privacy Payoff. So if you know how to harness the strength of privacy, you will get a sustainable competitive advantage. I think it is no longer true that just get as much information as you can and keep it for as long as you can. That, I think, used to be true in the past. The problem with that now, as you know, that if you collect that information in personally identifiable form, then that leaves you subject to enormous the potential for data breaches, the potential for identity theft, the potential for unauthorized use by third parties. So you can have a lot of liability issues from a privacy regulatory perspective. I mean, I'm not talking today as a regulator. In my jurisdiction, I am a regulator. We investigate complaints all the time. And the problem is, by the time it reaches me, the damage is done, and you're not going to have an easy time of it. So save yourself a lot of hassle by really trying to think through what are the needs. And if you think there are some peripheral uses of the data that may arise that you don't need right now, anticipate them and get the consent of your customers for it. So involve your users. And really, when you're talking to your users, increasingly, they're going to let you, as the trusted business that they're doing have relationships with, to collect more data and perhaps use it in a broader way. The concern is usually unauthorized third parties getting the data outside of the business.
Yeah, let me disagree with Ann to one extent.
David.
Don't collect information you don't know what you're going to use for. You know, we went after Sears in a settlement about 2 years ago for collecting all sorts of data well beyond the scope of what they represented to consumers they were going to use it for. And if you have a privacy policy, and I urge all of you to have them, in California you're required to, you can't say, we're going to use it for X, Y, and Z purpose and anything that may come up down the road. You need to be transparent about what you want to do. And let me just sort of talk about the perils of storing data you don't need. We entered into a very large civil penalty with Ceridian, a very large company that did employee benefits work, because they held on to data for way longer than they needed, way longer than there was any justifiable reason to have it. They experienced a breach, and as a result, tens of thousands of consumer information, including Social Security numbers, ended up in hands that, you know, we don't want to see happen. So I understand that, you know, data is good, more data is better, and even more data is great, but don't collect data that you don't have a here and now understanding of how you're going to use it, because if you don't come up with that novel use, it's an albatross that can come back and really bite you.
David, no disagreement.
Okay.
Hi. So quick point of reference and then a question. While both the speakers were up speaking, I was doing a little web surfing in the back of the room. Not a reflection on the speakers. Your talks are both good. And there's a relevant post up on Boing Boing today about a 24-year-old European law student who made a request of Facebook under the European equivalent of the Freedom of Information Act about give me all the information you have on me. He received a couple CDs with what he printed out to be 1,000 pages worth of material. He then sifted through that material and promptly filed a list of 24 complaints with one of the regulatory agencies over there. And it struck me that, you know, I've been kind of following this on the side, and these regulations are a moving target. They're evolving as the services are also evolving what they do. And what's the solution for companies like, let's pretend that Facebook did this, you know, is if they are in violation is out of kind of ignorance or you know, no malintent there. What's the solution for them to keep abreast of this? Are the standards bodies like the ones that Anne referred to providing facilities for companies to either, you know, have objective auditing come in or you know, get a slap on the wrist type warning, or is the answer like hire lots of lawyers?
Okay, that's a really good question, and it's a question that Danny Weitzner and I are spending a lot of time working on. The European model of privacy is to have very prescriptive rules, including the rule that you talked about, which is that any consumer has an absolute right to gain access to any private data held by a private company. And so it sounds like this law student was simply exercising his right or her right under German law to get what Facebook had. And the problem is that European law is very prescriptive, it's non-adaptive, and it doesn't sort of take into account the kind of business models like Facebook's, which depend on people wanting to share. And so we've been trying to work with our European colleagues to come up with a framework that provides greater interoperability. So there's greater ability of US companies to use the business models they've developed here abroad. We're not there yet. part of what I think of the virtue of the American legal system is we do not have very prescriptive rules. We have general principles, which we think we've articulated clearly, and as long as you adhere to them, you won't see me, which should be your goal.
And what I would add to that, just generally speaking, if you're a startup or if you're a small company, you don't have a lot of lawyers, and you're trying to figure out what should I be doing, think of the two principles, purpose specification and use limitation. What that means quite simply is, why are you collecting the information? Tell the user, be very clear, what's the purpose of the collection? Then, as the organization, use the information, limit your use of the information to that purpose. If you start there, you will have a really solid footing in virtually any jurisdiction. And then, as David said, the Europeans are much more prescriptive. There are nuances. If you go to our website, privacybydesign.ca, and look up Global Privacy Standard, in 2006, international commissioners all got together. I chaired a working group of commissioners, and we tried to, for tech companies, especially startups, simplify fair information practices into one legal instrument. And if you take a look at it, you'll see that data minimization for the first time is really addressed. If you don't need to collect the data in personally identifiable form, save yourself a lot of trouble, don't do it. Or if you have it collected that way, when you're using the data, sever the personal identifiers, the name, the social security number, encrypt it. Do something that doesn't leave it in plain view for access by identity thieves and others.
Great. So sadly, that's all the time we have for questions. They both use Twitter, which I'm really happy about. So please tweet your questions to them, and please join me in thanking Dr. Cavoukian and David Vladeck.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.